Yeah. Are you 14 and verse 13. And Moses said unto the people, fear ye not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show to you this day. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. That's what I want the Lord to do with some of my enemies. I don't want to see them tomorrow. I don't want to see them on Tuesday. I don't want to see them on Wednesday. I want the Holy Ghost to tell some of my haters, hit the road, Jack. And don't you come back no more. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. Went straight from Exodus to Ray Charles. Hit the road, Jack. Don't you come back. No more. Hit the road, Jack. Don't you come back. No more. When we read verse 1 through verse 4 of Exodus chapter 14, and God tells them to turn around and settle in the region of Pi-hahiroth. And then he says, in between the sea and Migdol. Brings me to what I want to talk to you about this morning. They got boxed in. And somebody in this room today feels just like them. You feel boxed in. This word Exodus literally means to make an exit. And this book that is mentioned by that name shows us perhaps the greatest demonstration of an exit in all of human history. This records that time when God delivered his people from 430 years of Egyptian captivity. He brings them out in Exodus chapter 13. And by the time we get to Exodus chapter 14, the same people who have delivered them have now set out to recapture them. But let me see if I can take that history and break it into some smaller pieces. Allow me to help put in context what is really occurring by the time you get to chapter 14. We're not going to take the time to read all of these verses, but I encourage you in your quiet time with God, and as my dear friend Dr. Lee would say, in your moments of meditation with God, I encourage you to read all of Exodus chapter 1. Several things of importance you will find really when you read chapter 1 all the way through chapter 13. The first thing that you find in chapter 1 is the cause of Israel's trouble. The cause of Israel's trouble. Several weeks ago, I preached about the life of Joseph and how God used Joseph to save his entire family by bringing them into the land of Egypt. Once Joseph's family got into the land of Egypt, they grew great in strength and in number. And everything was fine until the first generation died. Joseph died, his siblings died, his parents died. But by that time, the Israelites had grown so large in Egypt until it appeared as though they were outnumbering the Egyptians. Then the Bible says that there came a new Pharaoh in Egypt who didn't know anything about the contributions of Joseph or his family. All the new Pharaoh saw was that there were so many Israelites in the midst of the Egyptians, and immediately his heart filled with fear. Can I share this with you parenthetically? Some of the people in your life who do not like you, it is not because of what you have done to them, but what God has done for you. Maybe you hear what I say. There's some people in your life who don't like you. You ain't done nothing to them. You bought a new car. You didn't ask them to help make no payments. You brought a new house. You didn't ask them for a stitch of furniture. It's not what you did to them that causes them to drink a gallon of Haterade every morning. Their problem with you is what God has done for you. So I have decided, Sister Alicia, that just because people gonna talk anyway, I might as well walk in the blessings of God while you're talking. So at a minimum, I can give you something to talk about. The cause of Israel's trouble. The Pharaoh said, there are too many of these Israelites. Let's destroy them. The first thing the Pharaoh thought that he could do was work them to death, only to discover that the harder he worked them, the more they produced. Somebody don't testify, I can't lose with the stuff I use. Sometimes it's like throwing a rabbit into a briar patch. For some of us, even in the midst of the calamity we find ourselves in, the reason we are still able to swim like we are on still waters is because this is not our first rodeo. Somebody, this is their first time being broke. Ain't nobody have to tell us nothing about being broke. We got the t-shirt, the sweatshirt, the headband, and the mask. The cause of Israel's trouble. When they saw that they could not work them to death, then they said, we need to destroy, watch this, read it when you get home. They said, we need to destroy all the male babies. Leave the female babies alive, but kill the boys. And from the surface, that automatically seems diabolical. That the Hebrews, the Hebrew midwives were instructed by the Egyptian Pharaoh that whenever you are helping an Israelite woman give birth, if she gives birth to a baby, a male baby, kill it. If she gives birth to a female baby, leave the female alive. Well, why would you do such a thing? It is because, Brother Mike, anything that the enemy cannot destroy, he seeks to dilute. You didn't get what I said? Anything that the enemy cannot destroy, he seeks to dilute. He says, stop all the males at birth so that they don't produce more females and more males. But leave the females alive so that the Israelite females can intermarry and reproduce with the Egyptian males, and eventually you'll wipe out the Hebrew race. It was genocide in Exodus chapter 1. That is the cause of Israel's trouble. The second thing that the Bible tells us about is the cure for Israel's trouble. What was God's response to the Egyptians trying to destroy God's people? Well, after the Egyptians gave the command to kill all of the Hebrew boys, there was one Hebrew mom and dad that had a special baby boy, and they did not want to kill him. They hid him for 3 months until they could hide him no longer. They then decided that they would execute a measure of salvation. They took a little basket, shaped it like a boat, and then they waterproofed the basket, went down to the waters of the Nile River, set the basket into the water, watched the basket float away, then instructed one of their daughters to see where the basket went. As the basket floated down the Nile River, it floated all the way to Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh's daughter was down at the river's edge taking a bath with her servants. All of a sudden, she looks up and sees a baby floating in a basket. Calls for the baby to be brought to her and said, look at this good-looking Hebrew baby. All of a sudden, the young woman who was standing by the shore, who was actually the older sister of the baby, said to Pharaoh's daughter, you do know that you're not producing milk and you can't provide for this baby. Would you like me to go and get one of those Hebrew women to nurse this baby for you? The Pharaoh's daughter said, not only do I want you to go get one, but I'm going to pay her. Guess who the young girl went and got? The baby's mom. And she got paid to nurse her own baby. That young baby's name was Moses, named Moses by his mother because Moses means drawn out. And she says, because I drew him out of the water, I'm going to call his name Moses. And for the next 40 years, Moses grew up in Pharaoh's house. Don't miss this. The same Pharaoh who wanted to kill all Hebrew boys ends up raising a Hebrew boy for 40 years in his own house. At the age of 40, Moses saw an Israelite being beaten by an Egyptian, and Moses kills the Egyptian. Word reaches the Pharaoh, and Moses goes on the run for the next 40 years. By the time he reaches 80 years old, God meets him by setting a bush on fire, but the bush was not consumed. Moses had an investigatory mind, and he started getting close to inspect the burning bush. And God said to him, Moses, this is not science class, and you are not Bill Nye, the science guy. Take off your shoes, for the ground that you're standing on is holy ground. And at the age of 80 years old, God said to Moses, I want you to go tell that same Pharaoh, your partial granddaddy, go back and tell him to let my people go, that they may come and worship me in the wilderness. Born a Hebrew baby, raised as an Egyptian for 40 years, 40 years later, at the age of 80, sent by God to deliver his people. And then Moses spends the last 40 years of his life with the Hebrews in the wilderness on their way to the promised land. I like to say that the life of Moses was cut up into 3 sets of 40. He spent the first 40 years thinking he was somebody. The second 40 years discovering he was nobody. But the last 40 years learning that God can take a nobody and he can make a somebody. That's the cure for Israel's trouble. Well, we saw the cause of Israel's trouble. We see the cure for Israel's trouble. Let me breathe a word now about the case of Israel's trouble. By the time we get into chapter 14, in between chapters 3 and chapter 13, God let loose a series of plagues on the Egyptians, so that finally, by chapter 13, the Pharaoh of Egypt decided to let God's people go. That was in chapter 13. But by the time you get to chapter 14, the same Pharaoh who let them go is trying to recapture them. That's what you find in verse 1 down through verse number 4. God said to Moses, I want you to take my people, put them into a position that will make Pharaoh think that they are delusional in the wilderness. Look at verse 1 of chapter 14. God spoke to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn around and make a camp at Pi-hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. Camp on the shore of the sea opposite Baal-zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are lost. They are confused. Now, what I find to be interesting is when God sends them into this region, after he tells them to turn around, now get this, he delivers them in chapter 13, but puts them in a tight in chapter 14. Puts them in a region where there are mountains to their left and their right. Then he changes Pharaoh's mind. The same Pharaoh that had delivered them is now seeking out to recapture them. Mountains to their left, mountains to their right, Pharaoh's angry army pursuing from behind, and the Red Sea is in front of them. Let me see if we can go on a field trip. They've been delivered in 13. In 14, God causes the Pharaoh to change his mind about setting them free. And God sends them to a place where they have mountains on their left, mountains on their right. Red Sea in front, army pursuing from behind. Okay, maybe you're not there yet. Mountains on the left, mountains on the right. Red Sea in front, army pursuing from behind. You know what I call that? Boxed in. Immovable objects on both sides. Angry army pursuing from behind. Their greatest fear staring them in the face. When you study the language of the Old Testament, you discover that according to Exodus chapter 12 and verse 36, there were 600,000 men above the age of 20 in this group. That means when you add the women and children, there were most likely 2 to 3 million people following God, and they still ended up boxed in. We see the cause of Israel's trouble, the cure for Israel's trouble, that was Moses, but then we see the case of Israel's trouble. Pastor Paul, Pastor Paul. You mean to tell me that they had a genuine cause, a supernatural cure, but they still found themselves in a case? Can I say it to you this way? Even when you have a legitimate cause, even when you have a supernatural cure, God will still allow you to catch a case. Okay, you didn't come to have church all the way. Okay, I guess it's not for everybody. But one, maybe it's just for me and for you. Because somebody in here knows what it's like to go to God and give him your legitimate cause. God, in response, will give you a supernatural cure to fix what your cause is. But even after he gives you a cure, he'll still allow you to catch a case. And what occurs in chapter 13 and chapter 14, they caught a case. But the same God who brought them in is the God who is able to bring them out. What do you do when you are boxed in? I'm so glad you asked. There's an answer for it in the text. I want to read Moses' words. I want to read them from the King James Version, because Moses tells us what to do when we find ourselves boxed in. It's right there in verse 13. The Bible says in the King James Version, and Moses said unto the people, fear ye not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show to you today. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. Pastor, what do I do when I'm boxed in? Here's the first one. Fear not. fear not. That's what he says in verse 13. Fear not. You say, well, Pastor, were they afraid? Yeah, they were afraid. Mountains on both sides. Red Sea in front. Army pursuing from behind. They were afraid. And God's word to them is fear not. One thing I don't like doing that often is hanging around people who so deep until they act like no nothing about it. I can't hang around you long. No, I was standing at a taco stand downtown a couple of weeks ago, and the weather started looking bad. You couldn't see any clouds, but you could hear some thunder off in the distance. For long, lightning struck so hard until it shook the whole taco stand. I hollered like a 4-year-old girl. And catch myself. Say, ain't you Pastor Todd? Don't you trust it? All of that's true. But that doesn't sound like it blew my car up. And I hollered. The pastor hollered. The Christian hollered. The 46-year-old man hollered. I don't want to be around nobody that don't holler sometime. The Bible says Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane and prayed 3 hours. And if Jesus can holler, I think I ought to be able to holler sometime. Fear not. He tells them in verse 13, fear not. That's not all that he tells them in verse 13. After Moses says to them, fear not, he then says, stand still. Hey, watch this. Not your feet, but your heart. See, the problem with a whole lot of us, when we hear stand still, we hear don't move nothing. Some of us ain't moving yours. But when God tells them to stand still, we'll see momentarily, it's in verse 15, because in verse 15 he tells Moses to tell the people to stop crying and to get moving. Which means when God says stand still, he means calm yourself down. I've got this under control. Fear not, but then stand still. Stand still. Still your heart. Pull yourself together. And remember who you are and whose you are. And God is saying to somebody in this room, when the world shakes down, you don't have to shake up. And when the world around you is falling apart, you don't have to fall apart along with the world. Fear not. Stand still. This third one will mess you up. And. Problem with a whole lot of us. After we have put our fears aside, after we have collected ourselves, we think that the job is all over. But God gave them an and. Can I share this with you for free? This is Fourth Sunday. I don't charge on Fourth Sunday. I don't charge this close to the holidays. This is going to help somebody. Hopefully you're big enough to catch this. In whatever situation you find yourself in, whatever that situation may be. Y'all ready for this? It's deep now. I'm serious. It's deep here. Y'all ready for it? It's deep. Pastor, we ready? Say, we ready. Oh, y'all ready. Just because you've done all that you can do doesn't mean you've done all that can be done. Some of us know what it's like to struggle with something for 6 months. Then God sends you to the right person or the right place, and what you've been fighting with for months, they fix in 30 minutes. Sister Nana, I was on the phone yesterday with tech support with Cox Cable. You want to know why? Let me rephrase. Initially, because I knew they were short-staffed, I decided to log into their website and enter into a technical support chat. Would you like to know why I was chatting with technical support? I'm going to tell you. Because all of my premium channels on cable from Knox were playing in Spanish.
All right.
And the straw that broke the camel's back, I've been dealing with this since last Wednesday, but the straw that broke the camel's back is I was trying to watch Equalizer 2. And everybody who came on the screen speaking Spanish. So I logged in, I said I had enough of this. Because I don't speak Spanish. I'm working on English. And logged in, technical support. Lady gets on, starts asking me all about my day, how I'm doing, am I staying safe? I'm like, lady, yeah. But this movie is on now, and I would really like to understand what they're saying. So I'm right back, I'm fine. I asked her how she was doing. It wasn't that kind of day. Then she said, can you give me the serial number for your cable box? I said, lady, can't you just tell me how to fix this? Then she started naming stuff that she thought I could find on my remote. I ended the chat. 35 minutes of uselessness. So I called the technical support number. They put me on the phone with a person. Lady says, Mr. Thorpe, do you see the down arrow in the center of your remote? I said, yes, ma'am, I see it. She said, press the down arrow. She said, I press the arrow that goes to the left, press it 3 times, push the button in the middle, and your language choices will come. What one person did not fix in 35 minutes, another one took care of in 90 seconds. Just because you've done all that you can do doesn't mean you've done all that can be done. God has an and waiting on you. Fear not, stand still, and see. Because Moses said to them, fear not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. See. Hey, let me give you 3 or 4 statements that may apply to whatever it is that you find yourself in. Because somebody is wondering, oh, okay, I'm sorry, I'm not deep. Y'all deep. I'm not deep. I go through stuff and I wonder, what is God up to? In 2019, I asked God to do some things very specifically. I knew exactly what I wanted. I knew how to pray for it. I asked Him for it very specifically. Not only did God do the opposite of what I asked Him to do, He made it worse than I ever thought it would get. And I wondered, why? Sometimes you gotta fear not, stand still, and see. Well, Pastor Thorpe, what do I need to see? Well, let me give you 4 things you ought to consider. Maybe God is trying to teach you something. Some stuff the Lord cannot do by dropping it in your heart through osmosis. Some stuff He has to teach you. And when you read verse 10 through verse 12, what God teaches them is, if I brought you out before, I can bring you out again. Verse 10 says, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up and saw the Egyptians coming at them. They were totally afraid. They cried out in terror to God. They told Moses, weren't the cemeteries large enough in Egypt so you had to take us out here in the wilderness to die? What have you done to us? taking us out of Egypt. Back in Egypt, didn't we tell you this would happen? Didn't we tell you, leave us alone here in Egypt? What do you do when the people you're trying to deliver got complaints? They say we were better off as slaves in Egypt than as corpses in the wilderness. Here's what's funny about that. They are crying in chapter 14, and God just delivered them in chapter 13. Here's my question. When are you going to learn? When are you going to learn that if the Lord brought you out of that, if he brought you out of that, he can bring you out of this? Here's the real question. Did you give him credit for that? Because it could be the reason you're falling apart in this is because you took credit for that. If you would have given him glory for that, you can trust him while you go through this. Maybe God is trying to teach you something. Hey, that's not all. Maybe God is trying to tell you something. I know you thought that Sugar Avery was the first one to ever say that. God is trying to tell you something. And what you see in verse 1 through verse 4 is that God was trying to tell them that I will be glorified even through your darkest circumstances. Maybe God is trying to teach you something. Maybe God is trying to tell you something. But then, number 3, maybe God is trying to show you something. Because some of us work better through visual aid. Some of us, you tell us things. Some of y'all got kids like that. You told them something over and over and over again. They just couldn't see it. But the older they got, the more they had their own experiences, what they struggled to understand in the past, a day comes when they're able to see it clearly. Yes, sir. Just keep saying good morning. Oh, you gonna life will show you some stuff. People will show you some stuff. Some of you are trying to figure out who your real friends are. The Lord wants to show you who your friends really are. Okay, you don't like me. You don't like me. It's too much. It's too much. You trying to go through your list, see who's real, see who's fake. You want to know who your real friends are. Here's what God is trying to show you. God wants to show you who your friends really are. Here's what I mean by that. Even your realest friends will act fake sometimes. All of us have a bad day. And if you cut off all of us because we have a bad day, ain't gonna be nobody left. That's such horrible grammar, but it sounds good theologically. Ain't gonna be nobody left. So sometimes maybe God is trying to show you something. Well, I said I was going to give you 4. The first one, maybe God is trying to teach you something. Maybe God is trying to tell you something. Maybe God is trying to show you something. Here's the 4th one. Maybe God is trying to teach them something. Yeah. Because the Lord not only deals with you, sometimes the Lord got some stuff to show your enemies. Okay, we love the Bible. Like the 23rd Psalm. We love the 23rd Psalm. We love it, but we don't like it. We love it when we read it. We don't like it when we have to live it. Because the song says, Sister Nikki, that the Lord prepares a table before us in the presence of our enemies. Okay, let me hit rewind. The Lord prepares a table before us in the presence of our enemies. Which means, as badly as you want the table prepared, you cannot have the table prepared without the enemies present. And you're asking God to remove all your enemies, and the Lord is saying, how am I going to prepare a table if there are no enemies present? You do know that the thorns come with the road. Maybe God is trying to teach them something. You find it in verse 23 of chapter 14. In verse 22, the Bible says the Israelites, now this is after God has supernaturally delivered them. God said to Moses, don't cry. I know you got mountains on both sides and an army pursuing from behind, the Red Sea in front. immovable objects to the left and right, an angry army behind, and their worst fear in front of them. Remember, there were 2 to 3 million of them, and the last thing they wanted to do was to drown in the Red Sea. So watch what God says to Moses. He said, Moses, that same stick that you've been using in Egypt, stretch it out. And the waters of the Red Sea parted. And God called for an east wind to blow on the bottom of the Red Sea to make it dry like concrete. And all of God's people, 2 to 3 million of them, marched through the waters of the Red Sea. And they could look on their left and look on their right. The sea was piled up high on both sides. But they kept on marching. Look at verse 22. The Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground with the waters a wall to the right and to the left. The Egyptians came in after them in full pursuit. Be careful who you follow. Because your miracle is not necessarily my miracle. That's one of the things I love, Sister Mary, about what God does. Everything he provides is tailor-made. It is not one size fits all. The Egyptians came after them in full pursuit, every horse and chariot and driver of Pharaoh racing into the middle of the sea. It was now the morning watch. God looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud on the Egyptian army and threw them into a panic. He clogged the wheels of their chariots and they were stuck in the mud. That's the kind of God I need, a wheel clogging God. That when my enemy seeks out to destroy me, God will clog the wheels. The Egyptians said, now this is once they're in the midst of the seabed, run from Israel. God is fighting on their side against Egypt. God said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea and the waters will come back over the Egyptians, over their chariots, over their horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. As the day broke and the Egyptians were running, the sea returned to its place as before. God dumped the Egyptians in the middle of the sea. The waters returned, drowning the chariots and riders of Pharaoh's army that had chased after Israel into the sea. Not one of them survived. Sometimes God is trying to teach you something. Sometimes he's trying to tell you something. Sometimes he's trying to show you something. And other times he's trying to teach your haters something. The day is coming when even your haters are going to have to testify that can't nobody do you like Jesus. And can't nobody do you like the Lord. I called Moses. I was on my way to church this morning. I called Moses. I said, Reverend Momo. That's what I call him. I said, Momo. You said to the people in verse 13 to fear not. I said, now Moses, you know I've been reading book Exodus for some years now. I know how the story ends, Moses. But Moses, why did you tell the people not to be afraid when you knew they had mountains on both sides, an army pursuing from behind, and the Red Sea in front? Why did you tell them to not be afraid? And Moses said, Pastor Thorpe, you ask such wonderful questions when you're on your way to church. He said, the reason I told them to not be afraid in verse 13 is because God told me not to be afraid in 1 through 4. He says, Thorpe, before I spoke to the people, I had already received a word from the Lord. And Thorpe, the reason I could tell them to not be afraid is because I had, watch this, I had a word for it. Brother Dion, at the age of 16, I was in an accident while working on my first job as a diesel mechanic. I was driving a semi-tractor trailer. My foot slipped off the clutch. Clutch pedal swung back, hit me in the leg. And from the age of 16 to the age of 33, I saw 4 different doctors trying to get them to diagnose what was wrong with my leg. It was only when I was preparing to go to a game to watch the Florida Gators play football that the pain became so severe until I ended up in the emergency room. For the first time, they did a CT scan. They thought that maybe I had a blood clot. Then they scheduled me for an MRI, and they said, Mr. Thorpe, because of the accident you had at 16, you have a benign hemangioma in your left leg. Hemangioma refers to a collection of rogue blood vessels that have attached themselves together to form a benign tumor. I struggled with it from 16 to 33, but at the age of 33, I got a word for it. I didn't know what to call it from 16 to 33, but when I hit 33, I had a word for it. And Moses says the reason I could tell them to fear not in verse 13 is because I got a word for it in verse 1 through verse 4. And God wants to say to somebody in here today, whatever your issue is, God's got a word for it. That means that if you got a problem, God has a solution. You don't believe me? Maybe you're suffering with depression and grief. God says, I got a word for it. In Psalm 30, verse 5, weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Maybe you're dealing with uncertainty. You don't know how tomorrow is going to unfold. Some of you are worried about your retirement and if you will be able to retire. God says, if your problem is uncertainty, I got a word for it. In Psalm 37, in verse 25, David said, I have been young. Wish I had some Bible readers. And now I'm old. But I've never seen the righteous forsaken, nor their seed begging bread. Maybe somebody hurt your feelings and you have the need to feel vindicated. God says, I got a word for it. In Psalm 37, verse 1 through verse 2, God says, fret not yourself because of evildoers. He said, a day is coming, they'll be cut down like grass. They'll wither like a green herb. God says, I got a word for it. Somebody else says, Pastor Thorpe, my problem is confusion. I don't know if I'm to go to the left or to go to the right. God says, I got a word for it. In Psalm number 121 and verse 1, the psalmist says, I'll lift up mine eyes to the hills from whence cometh my help. My help comes from the Lord. Somebody is wondering if you're going to be able to pay your bills. If you're going to be able to pull yourself out of the hole you find yourself in. God says, I got a word for you. Psalm 23 verse 1 says, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Last second, I'm done. Somebody is wondering, Pastor, I feel like I'm at the end of my rope. I feel like throwing in the towel. Does God have anything to say to me? Oh, yes, he does. He says it in Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 31, but they that wait, which had somebody knew what I was talking about. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up. That's all I got to tell you. They shall mount up on wings just like an eagle. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. I don't know what your issue is, but get a word for it. Let God give you a word to pull you out of whatever you find yourself in. What do you do when you're boxed in? Fear not. Stand still. And see. That's all I'm doing all week long. I'm going to fear not. I'm going to stand still and see. God might be trying to teach me something. Might be trying to tell me something. Might be trying to show me something. Or maybe he wants to teach my haters to stop drinking head because I cannot lose in the stuff I do. And all the people say, amen. Just trust in Him. He will take